In 1851, deep in Louisiana's cane country, Bellefonte Plantation thrived along the banks of a sluggish bayou. On the surface it was prosperous and orderly, but beneath the curtain of Spanish moss lay unwritten rules that governed life and death. Among the grand plantation house and the slave quarters, power was measured not just in acres of sugarcane or cotton, but in the absolute control one family held over dozens of lives, and the quiet ways those in bondage sometimes fought back. This is a story about a very particular method of revenge, a tale of patience, maternal fury, and the thin line between healing and vengeance. A story that began with an enslaved midwife named Celeste, a secret knowledge passed down through generations, and a bloodline on the brink of extinction. What happened at Bellefonte Plantation in the sweltering summer of 1851 would forever change how an entire community understood the boundary between justice and curse. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And if this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you pondering the dark corners of history for days to come. Because how Celeste ensured the end of the LaRue family line? Well, some revenge is so cunning and subtle that it takes decades to be discovered. And when the truth finally comes to light, it's already too late for everyone involved. Bellefonte Plantation might have looked idyllic to an outsider, with its avenue of oak trees and the grand Greek revival house at its center. But life there was ruled by fear as much as by profit. The owner, Augustin LaRue, was a 52-year-old planter of proud French Creole lineage. He had inherited Bellefonte from his father and expanded its sugarcane fields to nearly 1,000 acres. A tall man with graying hair and a stern demeanor, Augustin believed unwaveringly in hierarchy and discipline. His wife, Odette, was in her early 30s, a delicate, raven-haired woman raised in New Orleans high society. To Augustin and Odette, the enslaved people toiling on their land were property, assets, whose lives and deaths were of concern only as far as they affected the plantation's productivity. What set Bellefonte apart from other plantations in the region was not immediately obvious to the gentry who visited for balls or business. They saw only the fine crops and the hospitality. But among the enslaved, it was well known that Bellefonte harbored something unusual, the quiet power of a midwife named Celeste. Celeste was 45 years old and had served the LaRue family her entire life. Small in stature and soft-spoken, she possessed knowledge of healing, childbirth, and herbal lore, far beyond what any official doctor in the parish could boast. She had delivered most of the babies, black and white, on the plantation for decades. If a pregnant woman was in labor, it was Celeste who was summoned, sometimes even by neighboring farms in emergencies. Her deft hands had coaxed life into the world and, as whispers among her people later suggested, could just as deftly coax life away. Celeste's position gave her an unusual status. Augustin and Odette trusted her to tend to pregnant women, nurse the sick, and even care for Odette's own delicate health. They granted Celeste access to the main house at all hours and exempted her from the backbreaking fieldwork that consumed most enslaved women's lives. To them, Celeste was a model servant, dutiful, reliable, and utterly non-threatening. She moved between the worlds of the big house and the slave quarters with ease, gathering information as naturally as one gathers wild herbs. Each day she donned a humble brown homespun dress, kept her eyes downcast, and performed her duties with a quiet efficiency that made her almost invisible to her masters. But Celeste was far from invisible to her fellow slaves. They knew her as a healer who could soothe a fever or ease a difficult birth. They also saw the flicker of intelligence in her eyes that she hid from the whites. Celeste had a long memory, and she carefully observed the dynamics of Bellefonte. She noted how Augustine's pride would swell when talking about his ancestors, how Odette's hands trembled slightly whenever another pregnancy was mentioned, how the overseer drank himself silly on Saturday nights and stumbled to his cabin by the wisteria arbor. Every detail might be useful. Life for the enslaved at Bellefonte followed a harsh and predictable pattern. A loud iron bell clanged each morning before sunrise, rung personally by the overseer, a burly Scots-Irish man named Henry Crenshaw, whose cruelty was as legendary as the gator skin boots he wore. At the bell's summons, men, women, and children alike rose from their pallets in the slave quarters and marched out into the dim light to begin work. Breakfast was a paltry affair, maybe cornbread or cold grits, swallowed quickly under Crenshaw's watchful eye. By first light, the field gangs were already bent over among the endless rows of cane, the air thick with humidity and mosquitoes. Punishments on the plantation were swift and brutal. A small misstep, a tool dropped, a fatigued pause in the rows, a perceived tone of disrespect, could provoke the overseer's wrath. In the center of the slave quarters yard loomed a whipping post, its wood darkly stained by years of blood. Celeste had seen countless men and women bound to that post. Henry Crenshaw's preferred instrument was a leather bullwhip braided with wire. One strike could slice open flesh. 10 could leave a person permanently maimed. The screams from the post echoed across the plantation, serving as a constant warning to all who might consider defiance. Celeste learned early in life to school her features during these public tortures. As midwife and healer, she was often ordered to stand by during punishments, ready to keep the victim alive once the lesson was taught. Many a time she pressed a cloth to a gaping lash wound, staunching blood and applying spiderweb poultices with steady hands, all while anger and sorrow vied inside her heart. Each cry of pain, each sobbing plea for mercy that went unanswered by the LaRue family, etched itself into Celeste's soul. She remembered them all. Despite the daily terror, Celeste's face remained a mask of calm subservience. When Augustine rode out on horseback to inspect the fields, she curtsied and bowed her head. When Odette called for a tonic to soothe her nerves, Celeste was there with a silver tray and a respectful, "Yes, ma'am." This facade was her armor, her camouflage. Over the years, it had become nearly perfect. Yet beneath that armor simmered a quiet rage. Celeste had not always been so hardened. There was a time when she had hoped for small mercies, when she believed her devotion to her duties might spare her family from the worst of the pain. But that was before 1848, before the events that stole from Celeste everything she held dear. It was in that year that the true spark of vengeance was lit in her heart, a flame she would tend carefully for years until the moment came to let it burn everything down. The tragedy that shaped Celeste's destiny began in the autumn of 1848, with her only daughter at its center. Marguerite was just 17 then, a sweet-faced girl with her mother's intelligent eyes and a shy smile. She worked as a laundress in the big house and often assisted Celeste with caring for the younger children in the quarters. Marguerite's gentle demeanor and blossoming beauty had started to draw attention, including a kind of attention no enslaved girl ever wanted. Augustin Leroux had a dark appetite that he kept behind closed doors. Like many slaveholders, he viewed the bodies of enslaved women as yet another entitlement of his status. Late one evening, under the guise of needing help in the estate's carriage house, Augustin cornered Marguerite. She tried to slip away, murmuring that her mother would be looking for her, but Augustin blocked the exit. With a low voice thick with the scent of brandy, he told her this would be their little secret. Marguerite's pleas fell on deaf ears. That night, Augustin forced himself upon the young girl, committing the vilest betrayal of the trust Celeste had placed in him by serving his household faithfully. He didn't stop at just once. Over the weeks that followed, Augustin found excuses to pull Marguerite into secluded corners whenever the opportunity arose. A shadowy pantry here, an empty stable stall there. Each time, Marguerite was left shaken, bruised, and sworn to silence under threat of the most dire consequences. Augustin warned her that if she ever spoke of what happened, not only would he kill her, but he'd make her mother disappear as well. The terrified girl believed him. She endured the repeated assaults in mute misery, convinced that obeying him was the only way to keep Celeste safe from his wrath. Celeste noticed the changes in her daughter almost immediately. Marguerite, once talkative and quick to laugh in rare moments of rest, grew quiet and jumpy. She avoided her mother's eyes, started waking from nightmares, and flinched at unexpected touches. Celeste suspected something was very wrong, but Marguerite, petrified by Augustine's threats, refused to confide in her at first. It wasn't until the early spring of 1849, when Marguerite could no longer hide the signs of pregnancy, that the awful truth finally came out. Late one night, Celeste found Marguerite silently weeping behind the cookhouse, one hand resting protectively over her belly. Gently, Celeste coaxed the story from her daughter. Between sobs, Marguerite confessed what Augustin had done, how long it had been going on, and the terror she felt now that she carried the child of her enslaver. A child who would be born into slavery, and even worse, was the product of violence. Celeste held her daughter as the girl shook in her arms. In Celeste's mind, horror and fury warred with heartbreak. She wanted to scream, to claw Augustine's eyes out, to do something, but she forced herself to remain calm for Marguerite's sake. By the time Marguerite fell into an exhausted sleep, Celeste's tears had dried. In their place was a steely resolve unlike anything she'd felt before. Celeste knew they had to hide the pregnancy as long as possible. If Odette or the overseer discovered it, Marguerite would face unimaginable danger. She began dressing her daughter in looser frocks and contrived to keep her working on tasks away from prying eyes. For a few months, it worked, but secrets rarely last on a plantation. By the end of July 1849, when Marguerite was around 5 months along, rumors of the young slave girl's condition had reached the mistress's ears. Odette Leroux may have been sheltered, but she was not naive. The thought that her husband could be involved with a slave girl, and that the girl was now pregnant, filled her with a volatile mix of rage, jealousy, and fear of scandal. One sweltering afternoon, Odette cornered Marguerite in an upstairs hallway, away from the slaves' quarters. Pointing at Marguerite's midsection, which even a loose apron could no longer conceal, Odette coldly demanded to know the name of the baby's father. Marguerite froze, eyes on the floor, unable to speak. Odette's face went white as realization struck. She didn't need an answer. The guilty silence was confirmation enough of her husband's infidelity and exactly who was responsible. What happened next occurred with frightening speed. Odette, determined to remove this living reminder of her husband's betrayal, insisted that Marguerite be sold immediately before the pregnancy advanced any further. That very evening, Augustin, perhaps relieved to have a quick solution to an unspeakable problem, agreed to his wife's plan. He wrote a terse entry in the account ledger: mulatto girl, Marguerite, 17, with child, sold to trader F. Beauregard, $800. The deal had already been arranged by letter in secret. Celeste learned of her daughter's impending sale only as it was happening. She had been in the quarters grinding medicinal herbs when another slave dashed in to tell her that Marguerite was being taken away right now. Heart pounding, Celeste ran toward the front of the house. There, she found a scene that seared itself into her memory forever. Marguerite, wrists shackled and eyes wide with despair, being lifted into the back of a trader's wagon. Odette stood on the mansion's columned porch, arms crossed, coldly observing. Augustin lingered by the steps, avoiding Celeste's gaze. Celeste rushed forward, but Henry Crenshaw stepped into her path and seized her by the arm before she could reach her daughter. "Don't make this worse now," he growled under his breath, fingers digging cruelly into Celeste's flesh. Marguerite reached out as if to grasp hold of the air, tears streaming down her face. "Mama!" she cried once, voice cracking, before the trader's assistant roughly yanked her fully into the wagon and slid the barred door shut. Celeste thrashed against the overseer's grip, a raw, keening wail rising from her throat. But Augustin stepped forward and struck her hard across the face. The slap echoed like a gunshot. Celeste staggered, and the overseer held her upright. "Enough," Augustin hissed quietly, so only Celeste and Crenshaw could hear. Then, louder and with a semblance of pity, he added, "I'm sorry, Celeste, but this has to be done. Get back to your work." His tone was icy, permitting no argument. Dazed from the blow and the shock, Celeste could only watch in numb horror as the wagon lurched into motion. Its wheels crunched on the gravel drive, carrying Marguerite away to God knows where. Marguerite pressed her tear-streaked face against the small barred window at the back of the wagon, locking eyes with her mother for one wrenching moment, until distance turned her into a blur. Celeste collapsed to her knees in the dust as a light rain began to fall from the iron-gray sky. She didn't feel the pebbles cutting into her skin or the drizzle soaking her kerchief. All she felt was an abyssal emptiness, rapidly filling with white-hot hate. In that single day, Celeste's world was shattered. Marguerite was gone. Her only child ripped away, along with the unborn grandchild Celeste would likely never meet. That night, Celeste sat in her dark cabin and made a promise to the spirits of her ancestors. The LaRue family would pay for this, dearly. The fallout of Marguerite's sale was immediate within the slave quarters. Marguerite had been well liked. Her sudden disappearance under such cruel circumstances left an open wound of grief and anger among her people. Celeste's own mother, a venerable old woman named Nanette, who had taught Celeste much of her healing craft, took the loss especially hard. Nanette was about 65 and had already endured a lifetime of heartbreak. Her husband, Celeste's father, had been sold away years before, and 3 of her 6 children had died in infancy due to the brutal conditions of slavery. But losing her beloved granddaughter whom she had helped raise, and knowing the girl was carrying a baby who would also be lost to them, proved too heavy a burden for Nanette's spirit. In the weeks after Marguerite's departure, Nanette grew listless. She stopped humming her work songs and often sat staring at the cabin wall or the horizon beyond the fields, as if hoping to see Marguerite return. Celeste tried to care for her mother as tenderly as she could, sharing bits of her own meager rations and coaxing her to drink water in the heat. But Nanette was, in a sense, already gone. One humid morning in October 1849, Celeste went to her mother's cabin and found Nanette lying peacefully on her cot, eyes closed, as if in gentle sleep. Her spirit departed from this world. She had passed quietly in the night, a thin smile on her lips. Perhaps, Celeste thought bitterly, Nanette's heart had simply broken. Or perhaps she chose to follow her granddaughter's path into the unknown. They buried Nanette that evening in the slaves' graveyard, a swampy patch of ground beyond the far field, where simple wooden crosses marked those who died, with no last names and often no recorded ages. Celeste placed a small wildflower bouquet on her mother's grave, tears slipping down her cheeks despite her resolve. In her grief, she felt utterly alone. Marguerite was gone. Nanette was gone. Celeste's husband had been sold to a distant plantation years ago and was likely long dead from overwork. She had no family left. The LaRues had seen to that. Yet as she stood at the graveside in the fading twilight, Celeste also felt something harden inside her, a grim purpose knitting her back together. She would continue to play her part, to survive, but every step, every breath from now on would be directed toward one aim, to make Augustine and Odette LaRue experience the same desolation she now felt, to extinguish their lineage utterly as they had effectively done to hers. In the months and years that followed, Celeste became the epitome of an obedient slave in the eyes of the LaRue family. If they noticed that her smiles never quite reached her eyes anymore, or that the light laughter she once shared on rare occasions had died away, they attributed it to age or simply didn't notice at all. Celeste performed her duties with mechanical precision. She delivered babies, tended the sick, and mixed her herbal remedies as usual. Never again did she mention her daughter's name in the presence of the whites. To them, it was as if Marguerite had never existed. But in the quiet of night, Celeste whispered prayers to her ancestors and to powers older than Christianity, prayers for vengeance and justice. Some of the enslaved began to suspect that Celeste was on a dangerous path. They saw a new intensity in her eyes, a gaze that lingered a second too long on the masters when their backs were turned. On a few occasions, when Augustine's temper flared and he raised his hand, as if to strike some servant, those close by swore they heard Celeste murmur something under her breath, a strange, melodic whisper that sounded almost like an incantation. If asked, Celeste would shake her head and claim she said nothing. But these subtle acts did not go entirely unnoticed. A network of silent understanding formed around Celeste. The others didn't know details, but they understood the outline. Celeste had a score to settle, and many were willing to help her in small, secret ways if it meant retribution against those they all feared and loathed. For his part, Augustine began to sense an unease in the quarters, but he misinterpreted it. In late 1850, a plantation upriver had a foiled slave rebellion scare, and paranoia rippled through the parish. Augustine responded by increasing nighttime patrols and ordering Crenshaw to crack down on any whiff of disobedience. Several slaves were whipped on mere suspicion of stealing or of meeting in secret after dark. Celeste observed these reactions with cold interest. The more jumpy and oppressive Augustin became, the more the other slaves resented him, and the more they quietly looked to Celeste as a figure of solace and perhaps future deliverance. She never openly defied orders, but a quick nod or a soft word from her could quell a brewing fight or embolden someone to endure hardship another day. In this way, she maintained a tense stability in the quarters, not out of any loyalty to the LaRue's order, but so that nothing would erupt to spoil the careful plan forming in her mind. Amidst this simmering tension, fate appeared to hand Celeste an opportunity on a silver platter. In early 1851, a development occurred that shifted the household's balance. Augustin's eldest daughter from his first marriage, Geneviève LaRue, returned home to Bellefonte. Geneviève was 19 and had been away at a convent school in New Orleans since she was 15. Celeste remembered her as a young teen, a bright, kind-hearted girl who once sneaked sugar cubes to Marguerite when they played together as children. Now Geneviève returned as a young woman, educated and with a perspective quite different from her father's. Geneviève had spent years in the cosmopolitan environment of New Orleans. There, while not openly radical, she had been exposed to literature and debates about the world beyond the South. She'd read newspapers discussing the rising abolitionist movement in the North. She'd overheard intellectual conversations among her teachers about the morality of slavery. These ideas had quietly taken root in Genevieve's mind. Returning to the plantation's harsh realities was a shock to her conscience. Within days of her homecoming, Geneviève began questioning plantation practices that everyone else took for granted. One morning, she saw Henry Crenshaw strike an elderly field hand for not moving fast enough. The old man crumpled to the dirt in pain. Geneviève rushed forward instinctively and placed herself between the overseer's whip and the slave's frail body. "Stop it!" she cried, voice trembling with anger and compassion. Crenshaw was so startled that he paused mid-swing. That evening, Geneviève confronted her father. "Father, how can we allow such brutality?" she demanded, eyes flashing with righteous fury. "He's an old man, and he could have been killed for nothing." Augustin's reaction was a mixture of anger and alarm. He had anticipated that Geneviève might need time to adjust to plantation life, but he hadn't expected outright defiance. Taking her aside, he spoke in a low, strained voice. "Listen to me, Geneviève. I know the city has put strange ideas in your head, but here we must be firm. These people depend on our guidance. Discipline is the only thing they understand." His tone hardened as he continued. "I will not have you undermining my authority. Is that understood?" Geneviève bit her tongue and nodded, but inside she was seething. It was clear to her that cruelty, not some benevolent guidance, reigned at Bellefonte. Over the next weeks, father and daughter clashed in subtle ways. Geneviève took to visiting the slave infirmary, where Celeste spent time treating the ill. She would bring extra bread for the patients and speak kindly to them, a stark contrast to the usual indifference or contempt they received from whites. Celeste watched these interactions with guarded curiosity. She recognized the conflict blossoming between Augustin and Geneviève and sensed how it could work to her advantage. The tipping point came in June 1851, on a brutally hot day that brought simmering tensions to a boil. a 25-year-old enslaved woman named Effie, heavy with her 9th month of pregnancy, fainted in the field from heat and exhaustion. Instead of compassion, she was met with Henry Crenshaw's fury. The overseer, fuming that work had been delayed, ordered 2 field hands to tie Effie to the whipping post. He intended to lash a pregnant woman as punishment for laziness. As Effie was bound, other slaves turned their heads, bracing for the horrific scene. Before Crenshaw could deliver the first blow, Genevieve burst onto the scene, alerted by frantic whispers from a house servant. Without hesitation, she threw herself in front of Effie, shielding the terrified woman with her own body. "Have you gone mad? Get out of the way!" Crenshaw barked, shocked and livid. Genevieve stood firm. "I will not move," she declared, her voice high and trembling but determined. "This woman is ill. If you want to whip her, you'll have to strike me first." A tense standoff ensued. The gathered slaves watched wide-eyed. Never had they seen a white mistress defend one of them so brazenly. Crenshaw, unsure of his authority in that unprecedented moment, lowered the whip. Word raced to the big house, and Augustin arrived moments later on horseback, livid and incredulous. He ordered Effie untied at once, not out of mercy, but because his daughter's dramatic intervention left him no choice in front of so many onlookers. Then, with a vice-like grip on Genevieve's arm, he half led, half dragged her back towards the mansion. That night, the confrontation inside the LaRue home was explosive. Augustin's shouts could be heard even in the quarters. He berated Genevieve for shaming the family and giving the Negroes ideas. Odette was in tears, begging Genevieve to apologize and fall back in line. Genevieve, flushed with indignation and also fear, shouted back that she could not abide by a household that tortured women and children. At one point, Augustin threatened to send Genevieve back to New Orleans, or even to an asylum, if she persisted in what he called her hysterical folly. The argument raged for hours, until Genevieve, faced with the prospect of forcible removal, finally fell into an anguished silence. Celeste, serving tea during the altercation, kept her gaze lowered, but she missed nothing. The LaRue family was fracturing from within. Father and daughter barely spoke to each other in the days that followed. Odette anxiously hovered, trying to placate both. In those days of internal strife, Augustine's focus was on managing Genevieve's disobedience, not on the slaves. That lapse in attention made him vulnerable, and Celeste knew it. The more the family's attention was turned inward, the less they would see what was coming for them. Now, with Genevieve effectively silenced under threat, and Odette's nerves frayed by the household conflict, an announcement arrived that shifted everyone's attention. Odette LaRue was pregnant again. It was July 1851, and this news electrified the plantation. After years of heartbreak, it seemed the LaRues might have one last chance for a male heir to carry on the family name. Odette had endured 3 prior pregnancies in a decade of marriage, 2 miscarriages and 1 stillbirth. Each loss had devastated her and Augustin. Now at 32, Odette knew this could be her final opportunity. Augustin, though still at odds with Genevieve, suddenly found new purpose in protecting his unborn child's future. He vowed to do everything possible to ensure this pregnancy succeeded, improving Odette's diet, limiting her stress, and keeping Celeste, their trusted midwife, at her side nearly every waking moment. For Celeste, this development was the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to strike at the very legacy of her oppressors. Under the guise of caring for the mistress's health, Celeste would be in a perfect position to control the outcome of this pregnancy. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see how this chilling tale unfolds, because the most shocking revelations are yet to come. She quickly composed herself and offered Odette a warm, seemingly sincere smile when the mistress shared the news of her condition. "That's such blessed news, ma'am," Celeste said softly. "Don't you worry. We'll take the best care of you. This time will be different. You'll see." Odette returned a hopeful smile. She truly did trust Celeste. After all, Celeste had been by her side through every prior ordeal, providing comfort and care. The irony ran deep. The LaRues leaned on Celeste to safeguard this precious pregnancy, never imagining that she might sabotage it. In truth, Celeste had been quietly sabotaging Odette's fertility for years. During the 1849 pregnancy, Celeste had brewed Odette daily tisanes of cottonroot bark under the pretense of a strengthening tea. Within a month, Odette miscarried. In 1850, when Odette conceived again, Celeste slipped pennyroyal and rue into the soothing syrups she gave for the mistress's headaches. That pregnancy ended even sooner. Each time, the LaRues suspected nothing. Miscarriages were sadly common, and the doctor blamed stress or simple bad luck. Celeste was there to console Odette after each loss, her demeanor the very picture of sympathy, even as she secretly thanked fate for cooperating. Now, in 1851, Odette's pregnancy advanced further than any before. By early autumn, she was 7 months along and glowing with cautious optimism. Despite the strain of Genevieve's recent rebellion, Odette seemed healthier than in past pregnancies. Augustine remained anxious but hopeful, practically hovering over his wife. He even arranged for a respected physician from Baton Rouge to come stay at Bellefonte as the due date neared, determined not to rely solely on slave medicine when his heir's life was on the line. The doctor visited periodically to examine Odette, and each time he found her condition satisfactory. In fact, he praised Celeste's skill in keeping the expectant mother comfortable. Celeste listened to these praises with a polite nod, all the while continuing her secret work. All throughout the summer of 1851, Celeste tended to Odette with unwavering care and calculated malice. She ensured Odette took her daily drafts of herbal tonic. Some ingredients, like chamomile and raspberry leaf, were genuinely beneficial to quell nausea and prepare the womb. Others carried hidden effects. Celeste added a micro-dose of cottonroot bark often, not enough to induce miscarriage at that late stage, but enough to subtly weaken the unborn baby over time. She also laced Odette's evening tea with a touch of black cohosh, an herb that, in small, steady doses, could lead to a feebler fetus and complicate labor. These measures were administered so gradually and in such innocuous disguises that Odette never suspected a thing. By late November 1851, Odette was in her final month of pregnancy. The doctor had taken up quarters in the guest room, and Augustine was an anxious wreck, waking at the slightest noise in the night. The household was on high alert for the first signs of labor. Celeste stayed within arm's reach of Odette at all times, a dutiful shadow. Genevieve, for her part, was both hopeful for a healthy sibling and fearful, given the tragedies of the past. She prayed fervently for her stepmother and the baby, trying to push aside her own lingering sense that something was off in the household that she couldn't quite pinpoint. In the pre-dawn hours of December 2nd, 1851, Odette LaRue's labor pains began. A sharp cry brought Celeste to the mistress's bedside immediately. Odette, clutching her swollen belly, gasped that the baby was coming a couple of weeks early. A servant was dispatched through the drizzle of that winter night to wake the doctor and alert Augustin. Lamps were lit, and the big house stirred with urgent activity. Celeste helped Odette into a sitting position and checked her progress. The midwife's experienced fingers detected something worrisome. The baby was not positioned correctly. It felt transverse, sideways, a very dangerous orientation for birth. Normally, Celeste would attempt to massage and coax the baby into a proper head-down position early in labor. But this time, she did nothing to correct it. Instead, she rubbed Odette's back and spoke soothingly, allowing the labor to advance with the baby still improperly aligned. The physician arrived within the hour, somewhat breathless and nervous. He examined Odette, and his face tightened with concern. "The baby is malpositioned," he whispered to Celeste out of Odette's earshot. Celeste gave a grave nod, feigning worry she did not truly feel. Under the doctor's direction, they attempted an external version, pushing on Odette's belly to turn the child. Celeste made a show of assisting, but subtly counteracted the effort with gentle opposing pressure when the doctor wasn't looking. After a tense half-hour, the baby shifted, but into an equally perilous position. A full breech, feet first. A breech birth in the 1850s was a dire complication, often lethal to the baby and dangerous to the mother. The doctor's forehead glistened with sweat as he prepared for the arduous task ahead. Odette, by now, was in intense pain, her contractions coming hard and fast. Celeste held her hand and encouraged her in a low, calming voice. Internally, however, Celeste's heart thumped with a mix of anticipation and grim determination. Everything was unfolding according to her design. Augustin paced just outside the bedroom door, praying under his breath. Genevieve knelt by a nearby table, clutching a rosary and whispering Hail Marys. In the slave quarters, those who were awake knew that Miss Odette was in labor, and silently hoped the child would be born safely, if only to avoid the master's wrath that would surely follow another tragedy. A few, however, quietly remembered the strange confidence they'd seen in Celeste's eyes, and wondered if fate was about to answer in a darker way. As dawn's pale light crept through the drawn curtains, Odette's labor reached its climax. The breech birth was agonizing. The baby's legs emerged first, tiny and kicking weakly. Celeste and the doctor worked in tandem. He guided the baby's body, while Celeste applied downward pressure on Odette's abdomen. When the baby's shoulders stuck, the doctor had to reach inside to adjust, an ordeal that made Odette scream and nearly lose consciousness. Finally, after a harrowing effort, the baby boy's head slipped free, and the child was delivered into Celeste's waiting hands. There was no cry. The infant lay limp and blue, the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck. Celeste swiftly unwound the cord and willed the baby to breathe, but made no move a midwife normally would to stimulate a newborn. The doctor, alarmed, took the baby and attempted to clear its airway and rub its back. Still no response. Minutes ticked by in gut-wrenching silence as the doctor tried everything he knew. Outside the room, Augustin and Genevieve heard the silence and exchanged terrified, hopeful looks. Perhaps the baby was simply quiet. Inside, Odette panted, half delirious. Why don't I hear him? Is my baby okay? Please, let me hear him cry." Celeste gently placed a hand on Odette's shoulder, preventing her from sitting up. She locked eyes with the doctor, and a subtle signal passed between them. It was over. The baby was gone, likely stillborn or too oxygen-deprived to revive. The doctor's face crumpled. He had delivered many babies and lost some, but under these high stakes, it felt like a crushing failure. He's not breathing," the doctor said hoarsely, tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry." Odette's world collapsed in that instant. No, God, please," she sobbed, trying to reach out for her silent son. Celeste, the tiny corpse swaddled in her arms, held the bundle just out of Odette's view. It was a merciful instinct, perhaps, but also served Celeste's purpose. The mother's anguish needed to be prolonged just a little more. Even as despair engulfed the room, another deadly crisis was unfolding. Odette was bleeding. The traumatic birth had caused a retained placenta and uterine atony. Her womb wasn't contracting to stem the blood flow. Celeste recognized the danger immediately. The sheets beneath Odette were rapidly growing red. The doctor, snapping out of his grief, barked at Celeste to fetch certain herbs or instruments from his bag. Celeste complied slowly, deliberately. Every second counted, and she spent them unhurried. By the time the doctor had aromatic vinegar under Odette's nose to keep her conscious, and rolled up his sleeves to attempt removing the still embedded placenta, Odette had lost a frightening amount of blood. Genevieve had been summoned into the room now. The sight made her wail and nearly faint, but she mustered strength to rush to Odette's side, clutching her free hand. The other was in the doctor's grasp as he tried to encourage a contraction. Odette was fading. In a weak voice, she kept moaning, "My baby. My baby." Celeste finally handed the tiny blanketed form to Genevieve so that the daughter could at least show Odette her lost child. Perhaps seeing the baby might calm the dying woman. Genevieve knelt by Odette, tears streaming. "He's beautiful, Mama," Genevieve managed to choke out, holding the bundle for Odette to kiss. The infant's face was peaceful, eyes closed, a head of soft, dark hair visible. Odette kissed the baby's forehead and closed her eyes, tears slipping down her temples into her sweat-drenched hair. "Forgive me. I couldn't." "Save him," Odette whispered to Augustin, who had now stumbled into the room, drawn by the commotion. Augustin dropped to his knees by the bed, gripping Odette's limp hand. No, Odette, my love, you did everything right," he choked out. "Stay with me, please. We can try again." Even as he said it, his voice broke. Both of them knew this was the end of their hopes. Odette managed a faint squeeze of his hand and a final word. "Genevieve, take care of her." Then, as if the last of her spirit had gone with her child, Odette Leroux breathed her last. Her face went still, eyes half open, staring at some fixed point beyond pain or caring. A keening cry tore from Augustine's throat, a sound so raw and primal that everyone in the room shuddered. Genevieve clutched the silent baby to her chest and sobbed uncontrollably. The doctor hung his head, tears in his mustache. And Celeste? Celeste stood at the foot of the bed, head bowed as if in prayer. If one looked closely, they might have seen a single tear tracking down her cheek. Only Celeste knew if it was a tear of genuine sorrow for the lives taken, or a tear of triumph that her revenge was nearly complete. The double loss sent Bellefonte Plantation into deepest mourning and chaos. Augustine retreated into a shell of grief. For days he locked himself in the study, emerging only to drink himself into a stupor or to demand updates on futile things, like whether the doctor had really done everything possible. Genevieve was heartbroken and terrified for her father's sanity. Yet beneath her grief, she also felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Something about the tragedy gnawed at her. She found herself replaying the days and hours leading up to it. Little observations kept surfacing. Celeste murmuring incantations when she thought no one listened. The odd, bitter smell that had come from some of the teas. The fleeting smirk Genevieve thought she'd seen on Celeste's face when Augustine first cradled the stillborn baby in despair. Could it be? No, she chastised herself. That was madness. Celeste had always been their guardian angel in such matters, not a demon. But Augustine's mind did turn to such dark suspicions. Crushed by grief, he became haunted by questions. Late one night, only a week after burying his wife and son in a single small mausoleum, Augustine summoned the physician and pressed him for a blunt assessment. Could anything, or anyone, have caused this? The doctor was taken aback. He stammered that sometimes difficult presentations happen naturally. But perhaps if someone had administered the wrong herb or delayed calling for help. He couldn't say for sure. That was enough for Augustine. A seed of doubt sprouted and grew rapidly into paranoid conviction. He remembered how Celeste had been the last to give Odette drinks, how Celeste had insisted on handling much of the birth, how Celeste had comforted him with strangely hollow words when it was over. The more he pondered, the more one name beat in his brain. Celeste. She had been too unlucky with Odette's pregnancies, hadn't she? 2 miscarriages, a stillbirth, and now this catastrophe. All under Celeste's care. A less desperate man might have dismissed it as grief's hallucination, but Augustine, stricken and half-mad, began to see conspiracy and malevolence in every memory. He quietly started an inquiry of his own. He questioned the house servants who had assisted that night. Most were fiercely loyal to Celeste, or too afraid to cross her. They said nothing out of the ordinary happened beyond the expected tragedy. But one young maid, wringing her apron in her hands, admitted that Celeste had given the mistress a special tea to help with the pain about an hour before the doctor arrived. Augustine's eyes narrowed. Celeste hadn't mentioned that to him or the doctor. He stormed into Celeste's little apothecary room off the pantry the next morning, catching her by surprise. He began opening jars and sniffing contents like a man possessed. "What is this? And this?" he demanded at random, thrusting jars towards her. Celeste calmly explained each. Comfrey for poultices. Valerian root for sleep. Her serenity only enraged him more because he sensed it was a mask. Finally, he slammed his fist on the table, making bottles rattle. "Did you give Odette something you shouldn't have?" he snarled. Celeste met his gaze evenly. "I gave her what I give every birthing mother, herbs to ease her labor. Nothing more. I'd never harm Miss Odette or her child. Never." Her voice was so steady, and her eyes so sincere, that for a moment, Augustine felt almost foolish for accusing her. But then Genevieve, who had quietly appeared in the doorway, spoke up hesitantly. "Papa, perhaps it was just God's will. Don't do this." Celeste tried her best. Augustine's face twisted. he realized how crazy he must seem. A grieving man lashing out at the one person who had always helped. With a dismissive wave, he ordered Celeste back to her duties. Yet as Celeste slipped past Genevieve out the door, Genevieve caught a look on the midwife's face. A flicker of cold victory. Or was it just Genevieve's grief playing tricks? It wasn't just Augustine's gut that whispered of foul play. Whispers were also beginning among the enslaved community. They had seen Celeste's transformation since 1849, her uncanny confidence even under oppression. Some quietly suspected that Celeste had finally acted on her long-held fury. Among themselves, out of earshot of any white, a few slaves even expressed grim satisfaction. Old master's gettin' what he deserves. The Lord, or maybe the devil, done sent retribution to him through his own midwife. But none dared breathe a word of such things beyond their quarters. Augustine, unable to let go of his suspicions, took the extraordinary step of contacting the parish sheriff, Thomas Boudreau. The sheriff was a middle-aged man who had maintained order in the region for years, mostly by keeping enslaved folk in line and settling disputes among planters. He arrived at Bellefonte under the guise of a condolence call, but with a quiet directive from Augustin. Find out if someone, specifically Celeste, could be responsible for this tragedy. Sheriff Boudreau conducted his own subtle investigation. He spoke to the doctor, who admitted he found it unusual that the labor had been allowed to progress so long in a bad position, and that Odette had been given a particular strong dose of blue cohosh. He recognized the smell afterward, which he hadn't prescribed. He spoke to servants and heard the same from the young maid about the mysterious tea. He even managed to question a couple of slaves working near the big house, whose guarded responses like, "Can't say anything bad about Miss Celeste, sir," ironically suggested they were protecting Celeste. The sheriff grew uneasy. If Celeste had truly engineered harm against her owners, it hinted at a level of cunning and rebellion far beyond a simple crime. It hinted at an insurrection of one. And given Celeste's revered status among the slaves, arresting or punishing her could spark unrest. Boudreau reported back to Augustin carefully. "I can't prove anything conclusively. There are some questionable details, yes. If you want to pursue this formally, it will be tricky. But it's your call." Augustine's grief had metastasized into rage. He decided he would deal with Celeste his way, evidence or no. Late one night, he roused Henry Crenshaw and two stout field hands whom he trusted, as much as he could trust any slave, which at this point wasn't much. Armed with pistols and ropes, they barged into Celeste's cabin. Celeste was awake, perhaps sensing this confrontation was inevitable, and sat calmly on her cot as they surrounded her. By the dim light of a lantern, Augustine's face looked gaunt and feral. "Celeste," he said in a low, shaking voice, "I know what you did." Crenshaw roughly grabbed Celeste by the shoulders and dragged her out of the cabin. The two field hands, looking frightened and uncertain, followed orders and bound her wrists with coarse rope. Celeste did not struggle or cry out. She simply gazed at Augustin with an expression that was eerily placid given the circumstances. They hauled her to the empty carriage house, the same structure where Marguerite had been violated years ago, though Augustin didn't know that significance. There, Augustin aimed his pistol at Celeste and demanded she confess. Rain began to drum on the roof as a winter storm blew in, wind howling through the cracks in the boards. For a long moment, Celeste remained silent. Water dripped from her gray head wrap down her cheek like a tear. Then she spoke softly, her voice almost lost in the rain's din. "I did what any mother would do." Augustine's eyes bulged. "So you admit it," he shouted, pressing the pistol barrel to her forehead. Celeste stared down the barrel without blinking. "You killed my Marguerite," she whispered, a tremor finally creeping into her voice. "You all killed her. You and your wife and your damned overseer. I only returned the favor." Augustin trembled with fury. This was a confession of the unforgivable. His finger tightened on the trigger. Crenshaw glanced around nervously. Executing a slave without a trial was technically illegal, but at this point, the overseer just wanted this nightmare to end. The two field hand guards exchanged subtle looks of fear and resolve. Would they be expected to kill Celeste, their friend and healer? Some part of Augustin realized the precariousness. Simply shooting her might provoke the other slaves once word spread. No, he needed an example. "String her up," he ordered through gritted teeth. Crenshaw and the men hesitated. Celeste closed her eyes, lips moving in what might have been a prayer or a curse, or both. Outside, thunder rumbled. "I said string her up!" Augustine roared, waving the gun wildly. Lightning flashed, illuminating the manic anger on his face. With shaky obedience, Crenshaw and one of the men grabbed a sturdy carriage rope. They flung its free end over a ceiling beam. Celeste did not resist, as noose was fashioned around her neck, and her bound wrists tied to the rope as well. On Augustin's signal, they hoisted Celeste off the ground. She kicked once as the rope yanked her upward, then dangled, toes just inches above the puddled dirt floor. The men tied the rope off on a hitching post. Celeste's throat constricted under the nooses bite. She fought instinctively for breath, legs twitching. Augustine stepped forward, rain blowing in from the open door and soaking his coat. He spoke in a low, vicious hiss, meant only for her. "You think you've beaten me? Even if you killed my son, I can have another. I'll remarry, I'll rebuild. But you will die here, and history will never know your name." Celeste's vision blurred as the world darkened around her, but she forced her eyes to meet his one last time. With her final rasp of air, she managed to speak a few gurgling words. "Your line ends here. There will be no one to remember you." Augustine's face contorted with hate. He motioned to Crenshaw to haul her down slightly, enough to let her speak more. "What did you say?" he snarled. Crenshaw, looking pale, loosened the rope a fraction. Celeste coughed and inhaled raggedly, the reprieve momentary. "I said," Celeste repeated, voice a raw whisper. "Your bloodline is finished, Augustin. You just don't know it yet." Augustin's composure snapped. With a scream of fury, he lunged at Celeste, hands clamping around her throat. As if the rope weren't enough, he wanted to wring the life out of her with his own grip. In that instant, another bolt of lightning struck frighteningly close, blasting a tree outside and sending a shockwave that rattled the carriage house. Everyone froze, except Celeste. She laughed, a wet, choking laugh directly in Augustin's face. That unearthly laughter unhinged Augustin completely. He stumbled back, raising his pistol to finally put a bullet in her heart. Before he could fire, a new voice rang out from the doorway. "Father." "No." Genevieve stood there, hair plastered to her skin by rain, eyes wide with horror and fury. Behind her loomed Sheriff Boudreau, revolver drawn. They had followed the commotion and arrived just in time to witness the shocking scene. Celeste hanging, the master about to execute her outright. "Drop the gun, LaRue," the sheriff commanded, stepping between Genevieve and his deranged friend. "This has to be handled by the law." Augustin was beyond reason. "Stay out of this, Thomas," he shouted, his voice barely human. "She confessed to murdering Odette and my son. She's a sorceress, a devil. She must die." He cocked the pistol, but Sheriff Boudreau, with a practiced aim, fired first. The warning shot blasted a chunk of wood from a pillar next to Augustine's head. Augustine recoiled in surprise, and before he could recover, the sheriff and one of the field hands seized him and wrestled the gun away. Genevieve, sobbing, rushed forward and frantically cut Celeste down with a knife the sheriff had thrust at her. Celeste crumpled to the ground, unconscious or close to it, her pulse faint. Genevieve, not caring about anything else in that moment, cradled the older woman's head in her lap and sobbed. "Celeste, why? Why did it have to be like this?" Celeste's eyes fluttered open. Rain cascaded around them, thunder rolling. Perhaps it was the proximity of death loosening her tongue, or perhaps she wanted Genevieve to know the truth at last. In a raspy whisper, Celeste answered, "They took everything from me, child. Everything. I had nothing left to lose." Tears streamed down Genevieve's face as she realized what that implied. Her father truly had been complicit in some unforgivable cruelty to Celeste. Sheriff Boudreau gently pulled Genevieve back and signaled the field hands to bind Celeste's wrists again, this time in irons. There would be no lynching tonight. Instead, Celeste would be taken to town and formally charged with multiple counts of murder by poisoning, a capital offense that would lead to a swift trial and execution. But at least it would be official, the sheriff figured. It would avoid an outright slave revolt scenario by letting the law seem to handle it. Augustine LaRue, panting and glassy-eyed, was escorted back to the house by Crenshaw and the sheriff, leaving Genevieve standing in the rain as two deputies, summoned earlier by the sheriff as backup, loaded a shackled, half-conscious Celeste into a wagon for transport. Genevieve felt utterly hollow. The weight of the night's revelations, her father's monstrous rage, Celeste's vengeance, the collapse of everything she'd known, pressed on her like a physical burden. The wagon carrying Celeste splashed away down the muddy road toward town, flanked by mounted deputies. Genevieve stood watching until it disappeared into darkness. She would never see Celeste again. What followed in the coming weeks was a blur of formalities and further tragedy. Celeste was jailed in the parish prison. The trial, if one could call it that, was brief and largely a formality. Her reputation as a voodoo murderess had already spread. Despite Genevieve's brave testimony that she had no evidence Celeste did anything malicious, the other evidence, mostly the sheriff's and doctor's accounts of herbs, the maid's statement, and Augustine's testimony, was damning. Celeste, for her part, offered no defense. She sat silent, eyes closed, through most of the proceedings. When asked directly by the judge if she had poisoned or harmed the LaRue family, she opened her eyes, stared at Augustin, who sat in the front row, trembling with barely contained emotion, and said, "I did what I was compelled to do. Do with me as you will." That was as good as a confession to the court. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out promptly. The date was set for late January 1852, after a required waiting period. They kept Celeste in an iron-barred cell on the ground floor of the courthouse, under constant guard, pending her execution. But Celeste did not intend to hang at the end of a white man's rope. On the night of January 17, 1852, a tremendous storm lashed the parish, a cold front bringing fierce winds and torrential rain. Sometime after midnight, as thunder shook the town, the guards went to check Celeste's cell and found it empty. The bars of the tiny window were still intact, the cell door still locked. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Only a small pile of rope lay coiled on the floor where she had been. Woven into it was a single white feather. The guards were flabbergasted. An alarm went up. They searched every inch of the jail, the surrounding streets, the docks, even the rooftops. Bloodhounds were brought in at dawn once the storm passed, but they could not find her scent. Celeste had escaped. How? No one could ascertain. It became one of those local mysteries whispered about for generations. To many of the enslaved and free black community, it was clear enough. Celeste's powerful spirit, whether by earthly cunning or otherworldly aid, had slipped the noose once again. Some claimed sympathetic slaves working in the courthouse helped her, or that she used some hidden blade and rope to climb out through the chimney or an old drain. Others swore it was magic, pure and simple, that she transformed into a nightbird and flew away, hence the feather. In any event, she was never seen in the parish again. When Augustin heard of Celeste's escape, he flew into a panic. He barricaded himself in Bellefonte, convinced that Celeste would return to finish him off. But Celeste never came back. Perhaps even her vengeance was sated, knowing Augustin was now a living dead man of grief and fear. Indeed, without Odette and without an heir, something vital in Augustin unraveled. His business ventures failed as he neglected correspondence. Fields went unplanted. By the spring of 1852, he had begun drinking laudanum nightly to blot out nightmares of a silent, staring midwife creeping into his bedroom. Genevieve cared for him as best she could, but she was barely holding herself together. One morning in April 1852, Augustin Leroux was found in his bed, cold and lifeless, an empty vial of laudanum and a half-finished bottle of whiskey on the nightstand. Whether it was an accidental overdose or intentional suicide remained unclear, but to those around him, it seemed he simply lost the will to live and succumbed to despair. At the age of 20, Genevieve suddenly became the sole surviving member of the Leroux line, and the owner of a plantation steeped in blood and grief. In the weeks following her father's death, as she managed the funeral and started sorting his affairs, Genevieve had time to reflect. She read through her mother's diary, through old plantation ledgers, through letters, piecing together, at last, the full tapestry of Celeste's story and her family's sins. The sale of Marguerite, the abuse that preceded it, Nanette's death. It was all recorded in dry transactions and half-burned notes. Genevieve was horrified. She realized that, in a sense, Celeste's revenge was justified. Her family had brought it upon themselves with their cruelty. This realization transformed Genevieve's life. With no father or mother to constrain her, and no interest in continuing the plantation, she made a monumental decision. In June 1852, just weeks after burying Augustin, Genevieve Leroux filed the necessary documents to free every enslaved person at Duval Plantation. The Louisiana legal system made manumissions difficult, but Genevieve navigated it determinedly, using her inheritance to post bonds and secure approvals for each family. By late summer, the 22 remaining slaves of Bellefonte were officially emancipated. On the day she announced their freedom, there were tears of joy and tearful embraces, but also a profound, solemn understanding. They all knew whose unseen hand had truly guided them to this moment. It was Celeste's. Without Celeste's actions, heinous as some were, Genevieve might never have broken the chain. It was a bitter, complicated kind of deliverance. Genevieve could not bear to stay at Bellefonte. She sold portions of the land to pay debts and gave some plots to the newly freed families who wished to remain in the area. Then she left Louisiana for good, moving to New York to live with an aunt and devote herself to the nascent abolitionist movement there, turning her back on the world of her upbringing. Duval Plantation, bereft of its masters and with most of its slaves gone or independent, fell into disuse. By the eve of the Civil War, the once grand house was abandoned, its windows boarded and gardens overgrown. Locals whispered that the place was cursed. They avoided the road that ran past the front gate, especially on stormy nights. Some swore that on thunderous evenings they could see a ghostly lantern bobbing down the path from the house to the family crypt, as if a midwife's spirit still made her rounds. Others claimed the cries of an infant and the sobs of a woman echoed through the live oak grove during full moons. Such stories kept Bellefonte's legacy alive in legend long after the LaRues were gone. In the Reconstruction era, freedmen and their children would occasionally pass by the ruins and recount the tale of Celeste, not with fear, but with a certain pride. She had become, in their eyes, a figure of folk justice. Songs were even sung in hushed tones about Mama Celeste, who used Massa's own medicine to pay him back. As decades turned into a new century, historians and writers picked up the thread. Of course, official records, newspapers of the 1850s, described Celeste in demonizing terms. Voodoo murderess hangs, one headline had proclaimed, erroneously assuming her execution. But within African American circles in Louisiana, her story was preserved more truthfully through oral tradition. When the Works Progress Administration, WPA, interviews of former slaves were conducted in the 1930s, an elderly man named Jules, who had been a child on a neighboring plantation, recounted, "I remember that old Celeste. Folks say she put a gree-gree on the master's house. Babies died. The missus died. Even master died off. Some say she done it with herbs. Some say with a curse. But I tell you this, them that suffered had plenty sins of their own." Celeste, she was like the Lord's angel of vengeance, come to set things right in a way. We all cried when we heard she escaped. We cried out of relief and out of pride. To this day, if you travel to that remote corner of Louisiana and find where Bellefonte Plantation once stood, now just moss-draped ruins swallowed by swamp, locals might warn you, don't go poking around there at night. But if pressed, they'll tell the tale of the enslaved midwife who ended a proud family's bloodline. They'll say her spirit still walks those grounds, not as a restless ghost, but as an eternal guardian of the oppressed, and a warning that even the mighty can fall when justice comes calling from the shadows. What do you think of Celeste's calculated revenge? Was it justified or simply tragic? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm eager to hear your perspective on this dark chapter from America's past. If you found this story gripping, Hit that like button and subscribe for more haunting narratives that explore the shadowy, forgotten corners of history. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and stay safe.